Hanji students, the screen is visible.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
So, Bache, yesterday we had discussed about Narsimham Committee Report 1. Today we are going to discuss about Narsimham Committee Report 2. अब ये जो कमेटी है, this was set up in the year December 1997 under the Finance Minister P. Chidambaram. उन्होंने फिर से ये कमेटी सेट करवाई थी and they submitted their report on banking sector reforms. This committee was also called as Committee on Banking Sector Reforms, and they submitted their report in the year April 1998 to the Finance Minister Yashwant Sinha at that time. As they made certain recommendations in the first report also, similarly, they made a few recommendations in the second report also. This report, it covers issues which range from the merging of the bank, creation of the globalized level banks, closure of the banks, recasting the boards of bank boards, and revamping of the legislations related to the bank. Some of the major recommendations that were made by this committee were, I'm going to read each of these one by one and then explain you the meaning. Concept of narrow banking should be tied out to rehabilitate weak banks. If this was not successful, the issue of closure should be examined. Narrow banking, according to the committee, implies that weak banks should not be permitted to invest their funds anywhere except in government securities, as these were absolutely safe and risk-free. आइडेंटिफाई किए गए वीक बैंक्स कौन से हैं जिनके नॉन परफॉर्मिंग एसेट्स काफी ज्यादा हैं, देयर परफॉर्मेंस इज नॉट अप टू द मार्क, एंड द कॉन्सेप्ट ऑफ नैरो बैंकिंग शुड बी इम्प्लीमेंटेड इन दीज बैंक्स सो दैट दीज कैन बी रिहैबिलिटेटेड. अगर ये सक्सेसफुल नहीं होता, अगर नैरो बैंकिंग भी नहीं करके भी नहीं चलता काम. नैरो बैंकिंग क्या है कि एक तो देखो वाइड स्कोप ऑफ बैंक है, वेयर इन एवरीबडी, ईच एंड एवरी बैंक दे आर डूइंग ऑल द टास्क, वेयर एज नैरो बैंकिंग व्हेन देयर स्कोप और देयर एरिया ऑफ ऑपरेशन इज लिमिटेड. तो कमेटी ने क्या कहा कि वीक बैंक्स को सिर्फ परमिट होना चाहिए है कि वो अपने फंड्स को गवर्नमेंट सिक्योरिटीज में ही इन्वेस्ट कर सके, because these securities, they are safe, they are risk free securities, and if in case the concept of narrow banking also fails, what should be done? These banks should be closed down. The issue relating to their closure should be examined. Next, two or three large Indian banks should be given an international character. जो इंडिया के 2-3 लार्ज बैंक्स हैं, what they should be given, they should be shifted to the nature of an international character, they should be given an international importance. Small local banks should be confined to states or a cluster of districts in order to serve local trade, small industry and agriculture. जो आपके छोटे लोकल बैंक्स हैं उनका एरिया ऑफ ऑपरेशन कन्फाइन हो जाना चाहिए है either to a state or to a cluster of district, so that they can serve the local people over there, the small industries and the agricultural sector over there. The committee also commented on the government's role in the public sector banks by observing that the government ownership has become an instrument of management. Such micromanagement of banks is not conducive to the enhancement of autonomy and flexibility. गवर्नमेंट का रोल जो है पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स में कंट्रोल करने का, उसके ऊपर भी कमेंट किया. उन्होंने बोला कि इस मैनेजमेंट जो ये मैनेजमेंट हो रही है बाय द गवर्नमेंट ओनरशिप के कारण जो मैनेजमेंट चल रही है, इट इज नॉट गिविंग एन ऑटोनॉमी और अ फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी टू द कमर्शियल बैंक्स दैट आर वर्किंग. Functions of boards and management need to be reviewed so that the board remain responsible for enhancing shareholders' value through formulation of corporate strategy. The boards and the management of the banks, it should be reviewed कि उनका board of directors और management का क्या function रहने वाला है, उसको review करके it should be taken into consideration that the board it is mainly responsible for enhancing the shareholders value by formulating of the corporate strategies. Then there is a need to review minimum prescriptions for capital adequacy. What is capital adequacy? Capital adequacy is a ratio which helps in checking that whether a bank has enough capital in respect to their risk weighted assets or not. Each and every asset, they are carrying certain sort of risk, so whether the banks have enough capital with respect to it or not. So committee ne kya recommend kiya, that the minimum capital adequacy ratio, it should be raised to 10% by 2002, which means 1998 में ये submit हुई report. In 4 years they wanted कि capital adequacy ratio 10% के आसपास आ जाए. Then the committee also felt a need to lay down prudential and disclosure norms and sound procedures for the purpose of supervision and regulation. There should be norms, there should be disclosure norms that should be said, disclosure norms relating to whatever is to be disclosed in the financial statements, क्या procedures follow करने चाहिए हैं, ताकि जो आपने सुपरवाइज करना है और या रेगुलेट कर रहा है वर्किंग ऑफ बैंक्स को, आप उसको सही ढंग से कर सकें. Then there should be an integration of NBFCs. NBFCs क्या हैं? Non-banking financial companies, such companies which are not banks, but they are indulging into the activities, lending activities, पैसे देना, पैसे लेना. So these firms, इनकी जो lending activity है, it should also be integrated into the financial system. Then there is a need for public sector banks to speed up computerization and focus on relationship banking. They need to focus on the computerization कि जल्दी से जल्दी computerization हो जाए. A review of the recruitment procedures, training and remuneration policies in public sector banks should be carried out. किस तरह से recruit करना है, train करना है, remuneration pay करनी है, उसके ऊपर भी ध्यान देना चाहिए है. Then threat of action by vigilance and other investigative authorities, even in the case of commercial decisions, creates a low morale. So committee ने recommend किया कि ये जो vigilance की तरफ से या investigative authorities की तरफ से banks को कोई threat आए, कोई action का बोला जाए कि अगर आपने ये ना किया तो ऐसे action लिया जाएगा, it creates a low morale amongst the employees and the people working in the bank. So committee recommended that this should be outcasted. Then need for professionalizing and depolitizing of the bank boards. जो bank boards हैं which relate to the working of the banks, उसमें professionalism आना चाहिए. Political parties का जो उनके ऊपर pressure है उसको खत्म कर देना चाहिए है. And the banking service recruitment board, जिसके through recruitment करी जाती थी, that should be abolished. Is this clear to everyone?
Yes, ma'am.
So I'll share this PDF with you later on so that you can go through the topic. Coming to the next topic for today, we are going to discuss the Verma panel report. मैंने आपके साथ जब हम लोगों ने ये वाला यूनिट के सेकंड पार्ट पे पहुंचे थे रिफॉर्म्स पे, I told you at the same moment that initially for a few lectures we'll be covering up only the reforms. कि क्या क्या रिफॉर्म्स आए हैं. जैसे हमारे नरसिम्हम के 1 भी हो गया, 2 भी हो गया. जो थर्ड मेजर रिफॉर्म, मेजर सेट ऑफ रिफॉर्म्स इन द इंडियन बैंकिंग, दैट इज योर वर्मा पैनल रिपोर्ट. Let's look into this one now. Verma panel report, it is in the year 1999. In the 1990s, in 1990s, a tremendous progress was seen in the banking sector of India. The banking sector was dominated by the public sector banks. Due to liberalization in India, several new private sector banks emerged, due to which some public sector banks turned negative, while some public sector banks maintained their dominance. There was a need to study the performance of all public sector banks in order to give helping hand to poor or loss-making public sector banks in India. With the liberalization, पहले तो जो हमारा इंडियन बैंकिंग सेक्टर है, that was dominated by the public sector banks only. But with the liberalization, several new private sector banks also emerged. Because of the plus points of these private sector banks, better interest rate, better customer dealings and everything, so कुछ public sector banks की performance जौन सी है वो negative हो गई, whereas some of it they still maintained their dominance. So there arose a need that we should study the performance of all the public sector banks so that helping hand can be given to the loss making public sector banks. Because of this, the Reserve Bank of India, in consultation with the Government of India, they had constituted a working committee in the year 1999 under the chairmanship of MS Verma to look into the issue of restructuring of weak public sector banks. In its report of the working group on restructuring of weak public sector banks, the working group has first identified the weak public sector banks and then suggested the measures for restructure. Because a lot of public sector banks, they were making losses. So RBI ने गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया के साथ कंसल्ट करके उन्होंने एक ग्रुप फॉर्म किया जिसके चेयरमैन थे MS वर्मा, so that they can look into the performance of the banks, they can look into the restructuring of the weak sector banks. उस group ने, that working group, they submitted a report which is called as the report of the working group on restructuring of weak public sector banks. इसमें इस ग्रुप ने क्या सबमिट किया, उन्होंने पहले आइडेंटिफाई किए हैं कौन से बैंक्स आपके वीक हैं, which public sector banks are weak, and then they suggested measures for restructuring of this bank कि आप इनको किस तरह से अब रीस्ट्रक्चर कर सकते हो, फिर से कुछ चेंजेस ला सकते हो ताकि इनकी जो आइडेंटिटी है दैट कैन बी रिवाइव्ड फ्रॉम अ वीक पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक टू अ प्रॉफिट मेकिंग बैंक. इस वर्किंग ग्रुप ने 3 मेन पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स को वीक रिकॉग्नाइज किया था. वो है आपके इंडियन बैंक, यूको बैंक एंड यूनाइटेड बैंक ऑफ इंडिया. What were the duties of the Verma committee? Number 1 was to formulate criteria for identification of weak public sector bank. अब पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स में से कौन सा बैंक वीक है उसके लिए क्या क्राइटेरिया फॉलो करेंगे उसको फॉर्मुलेट करना. To study and examine the problem of the weak banks. What is the problem of these banks which have been identified as weak? To undertake a case-by-case examination of the weak banks and to identify those which are potentially revivable. हर एक वीक बैंक को एनालाइज करके उसको अच्छे से एग्जामिन करके ये आइडेंटिफाई करना कि इनमें से कौन से बैंक्स को हम रिवाइव कर सकते हैं. एंड लास्टली टू सजेस्ट अ स्ट्रेटेजिक प्लान of financial, organizational and operational restructuring of your weak public sector banks. एक strategy बना के देना, एक planning बना के देना कि हम कैसे इनको restructure कर सकते हैं. बच्चे just give me a moment. Sorry students, there was a phone call. The last duty of the committee was to suggest a strategic plan so that the financial, organizational and operational restructuring of the weak banks could be done. Now let's look into the findings of this committee. Findings mean कि उन्होंने जब एनालाइज किया, उन्होंने सारी बैंकिंग सिचुएशन के बारे में पढ़ा है, तो what have they concluded, what have they found out from the whole study that they did. In October 1999, the working group on restructuring weak public sector banks, they submitted the report, which is the third in the banking sector reform trilogy. तीसरे reforms जो है, these are your Verma panel committee reforms. Until the banks started adopting prudential norms relating to income recognition, asset classification, provisioning, and capital adequacy, 26 out of 27 public sector banks were reporting profit. जब तक prudential norms नहीं follow करी जा रही थी with respect to the recognition of income, provisions maintain करना, capital adequacy ratio को maintain करके रखना, 27 पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स में से 26 वर रिपोर्टिंग प्रॉफिट्स. Only UCO Bank was incurring losses from 1989 to 1990. In 1992 to 93, the profitability of the 27 banks as a group turned negative, with as many as 12 nationalized banks reporting net losses. In March 1996, when the banks had to attain capital adequacy of 8%, 8 public sector banks were still short of the prescribed level. जैसे जैसे नरसिम्हम कमेटी रिपोर्ट के रिफॉर्म्स इंप्लीमेंट होने लग पड़े, तो सारे बैंक्स का एक बारी तो प्रॉफिट जौन सा है टर्न नेगेटिव. लेटर व्हेन दे वर टू मेंटेन कैपिटल एडिक्वेसी ऑफ 8%, तो उसमें भी सबकी कैपिटल एडिक्वेसी 8% के आसपास पहुंच गई, बट देयर वर 8 बैंक्स which were still short of the prescribed level, which means they did not have enough capital to cover up their risk-weighted assets. Compounding the problems for the public sector banks were the deregulation of interest rates on deposits and advances that intensified the competition, and the starting of operations by a few private sector banks with good institutional backing. एक तो ये कैपिटल एडिक्वेसी वाली प्रॉब्लम तो थी, उससे उसके अलावा क्या हुआ, इंटरेस्ट रेट डीरेगुलेट हो गए बिकॉज ऑफ द रिकमेंडेशंस ऑफ द नरसिम्हम कमेटी. उसके कारण जो प्राइवेट सेक्टर बैंक्स थे जिनकी पीछे एक अच्छी इंस्टीट्यूशनल बैकिंग अप थी, वो दैट क्रिएटेड अ प्रॉब्लम फॉर द पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स. वर्मा पैनल कमेटी ने क्या रिपोर्ट किया कि कुछ पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक्स तो एडजस्ट कर गए हैं. With the changing business environment, they have handled the competition also, whereas a few of them, they are not able to do so. So, report ने identify किए 8 banks in which the accumulated losses and the net non-performing assets, they exceeded the net worth of the bank. कौन से 8 बैंक्स थे ये? इलाहाबाद बैंक, इंडियन बैंक, इंडियन ओवरसीज बैंक, पंजाब एंड सिंध बैंक, स्टेट बैंक ऑफ इंडिया, मैसूर एंड ट्रावनकोर एंड यूनाइटेड बैंक ऑफ इंडिया. ये 8 बैंक आपके ऐसे बैंक्स थे जिनके accumulated losses थे और उनके net non-performing assets, they were exceeding the net worth of the bank. Earlier, the Committee on Banking Sector Reforms had identified a weak bank as one with accumulated losses and net non-performing assets exceeding the net worth of the bank, or where the operating profit less the income on recapitalization bonds has been negative for 3 consecutive years. जहां पहले की कमिटीज थी उन्होंने वीक बैंक इन बेसिस के ऊपर आइडेंटिफाई किया था. वर्मा पैनल ने रेकमेंड किया कि there are 7 parameters. These parameters should be taken into consideration in conjunction with the earlier mentioned parameters, so as to identify which banks are weak banks. Now, what are these 7 parameters? First one is your capital adequacy ratio, which is the ratio of your capital with respect to the risk-weighted assets. Then comes your return on assets. कैसे कैलकुलेट करते हैं रिटर्न ऑन एसेट्स? हम नेट इनकम डिवाइडेड बाय टोटल एसेट्स, कि टोटल एसेट्स के ऊपर आपको कितना रिटर्न मिल रहा है. Then comes your net interest margin. बैंक्स का नेट इंटरेस्ट मार्जिन क्या है? एक तो बैंक को इंटरेस्ट आता है लोन्स के ऊपर, इट अमाउंट इट अर्न्स ऑन द लोन. एक बैंक इंटरेस्ट पे करता है ऑन द डिपॉजिट्स. सो जो लोन पे वो इंटरेस्ट उसको मिलता है और वो जो डिपॉजिट्स पे इंटरेस्ट देता है, उसमें जो डिफरेंस है, दैट इज देयर नेट इंटरेस्ट मार्जिन. Fourth parameter, it is your ratio of operating profit to average working funds of the business concern. Ratio of the cost to income of the bank. कवरेज रेशियोज जो आप कवर करते हैं, जैसे आपकी डेट सर्विस रेशियो हो गई. सो ऑल ऑफ दीज कवरेज रेशियोज दैट आर टू बी टेकन इनटू कंसिडरेशन. एंड रेशियो ऑफ स्टाफ कॉस्ट टू इनकम. जो आपकी स्टाफ के ऊपर आपका खर्चा आ रहा है, आपको उसके हिसाब से इनकम हो रही है कि नहीं हो रही है, दैट इज योर रेशियो ऑफ स्टाफ कॉस्ट टू इनकम. It has identified 3 banks where operating profits less the income on recapitalization bond had been negative for 3 years ending 1998-99, which were Indian Bank, UCO Bank, and United Bank of India. The group identified continuous decline in profitability and efficiency of these banks, and it also identified that they are depending upon government for the capital support, which was a matter of concern. They identified the reasons for the weaknesses of the banks, which were related to the operation, the way they were operating, the way they were managing the bank, and the human resources, the people who were working with the bank. And they suggested that it is very important that these banks should be immediately restructured so that the banks can be revived. So what are the recommendations? अभी तक क्या थे हमारी findings? अब क्या है आपकी recommendations? क्या recommend किया? पहले तो ये जो 7 parameters हैं, which relate to the solvency, the earning capacity and profitability, ये identify किए. जो टेस्ट या definitions which are provided by Committee on Banking Sector Reforms, they should be supplemented. जो आपकी पिछली नरसिम्हम कमेटी वाले reforms थे, they should be supplemented, they should be added on by the performance analysis based upon the 7 parameters for identifying weaknesses in the banks in future. तो जो उनके पहले वाले हैं cumulated losses वाला for the period of 3 years, उसके साथ साथ इन 7 parameters को भी consider किया जाना चाहिए है to judge the weakness of the banks. These 7 parameters, they can also be used to evolve benchmarks for competitive levels of performance by the public sector banks. जब आपने banks की performance को एक दूसरे के साथ compare करना है, then also you can use these parameters. Only narrow bank cannot be accepted as a policy in order for a long-term restructuring. And the closure, because it involves many negative externalities, like it affects the depositors, it affects the borrowers, it affects the employees, so it should not be exercised unless all other options are exhausted. ये नहीं है कि बैंक वीक बैंक हो गया जी चलो बैंक बंद कर दो, नहीं. अगर आप बैंक बंद कर रहे हो उसका नेगेटिव इम्पैक्ट भी काफी आने वाला है. डिपॉजिटर्स पे आएगा, जिन्होंने पैसे डिपॉजिट किए हैं, बोरोअर्स पे आएगा, एम्प्लॉइज पे आएगा, इकोनॉमी पे आएगा. सो इट शुड ओनली बी एक्सरसाइज्ड एज एन ऑप्शन व्हेन ऑल अदर ऑप्शंस ऑफ रिवाइविंग दैट वीक बैंक दे हैव एग्जॉस्टेड. The government, management, and employee unions must agree upon every important condition of the proposed restructuring program before it is begun. जब आप बैंक्स को restructure करने लगे हो तो जो गवर्नमेंट, जो मैनेजमेंट है उन बैंक की और जो एम्प्लॉय यूनियंस है pertaining to the employees that are working over there, उनको restructuring प्रोग्राम की हर एक कंडीशन को मानना चाहिए. Restructuring of banks, it should be a 2-stage process. Stage 1, जिसमें हम क्या करेंगे, ऑपरेशनल, ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल एंड फाइनेंशियली रीस्ट्रक्चर करने की कोशिश करेंगे ताकि हम उनको रीस्टोर कर सके, उनकी कॉम्पिटिटिव एफिशिएंसी को रीस्टोर कर सके. Whereas your stage 2, it should have options related to the privatization or merger. कि अगर आपका पब्लिक सेक्टर बैंक नहीं अच्छे से परफॉर्म कर रहा है तो या तो आप उसको मर्ज कर दो या आप उसको प्राइवेटाइज कर दो. 30 to 35% reduction in staff cost is required in the 3 identified weak banks to enable them to reach to the median level of staff ratio of staff cost to operating income. जो उनकी रेशियो ऑफ स्टाफ कॉस्ट टू ऑपरेटिंग इनकम है वो भी इन 3 वीक बैंक्स की जौन सी है वो बहुत कम. तो स्टाफ कॉस्ट को भी हमें रिड्यूस करने की कोशिश करनी चाहिए. The organizational reconstruction includes delaying of the decision-making process relating to credit, rationalization of branch network, etc. जो ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल रीस्ट्रक्चरिंग है उसमें हम क्या इंक्लूड कर रहे हैं कि डिसीजन मेकिंग थोड़ी क्विक हो, बिकॉज दे आर हैविंग वेरी डिलेड डिसीजंस related to credit, related to rationalization of the networks of the branching. And financial restructuring, it involves efforts to maintain a capital adequacy ratio well above the minimum capital required level. Further recapitalization subject conditionalities relating to operational and organizational restructuring of the recipient bank. Restructure करें फाइनेंशियल को ताकि हमारे पास इतना कैपिटल हो कि आपका रिक्वायर्ड लेवल से ज्यादा रहे. Coming to the conclusion of the committee concluding saying that the restructuring program will have to encompass operational, organizational, financial, and systemic restructuring. The committee has strongly suggested sticking to the implementation in a time-bound manner. It feels that any delay will add to the restructuring cost. If the recommendations of the committee are implemented in a piecemeal manner, the desired effect will not be attained. The option of closing the bank should be given lesser weightage than the option of privatizing or merging them. वो कहते हैं कि अगर हम एक करके चीज को इम्प्लीमेंट करेंगे तब नहीं काम आएगा. जो आपने रीस्ट्रक्चर करना है ऑपरेशनल लेवल, ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल लेवल, फाइनेंशियल लेवल, वो आपको एक ही बार इकट्ठे करना पड़ेगा. And in order to attain the desired effect, and rather than having the option of closing the banks or shutting down the bank, what should be the option? The option should be to privatize or to merge the banks. Is this clear?
Yes, ma'am.
Any student having any doubts? Any student having any doubts? All right then students, this is it for today. Have a good day. Manpreet, the whole committee reform is going to be there.
Okay.
Whenever a question will come, they will say suggest or discuss in detail the Verma panel committee report. तो वो उसमें आपको ये सारा लिखना ही पड़ेगा. Manpreet Bangad, is this clear, बच्चे?
Yes, ma'am.
All right then students, I'll be ending this session here. Have a good day. I'll be sharing the PDF and the PPT with you on your common email ID.